Eugene's mind was floating elsewhere as he dabbled in reality. He was attending another session with Autumn Walker, and she was beginning to notice that he was distracted. "Are there any updates about your daughter, Grace?" she asked, hoping to rip him from the depths of his daydreaming. Eugene cupped his hands together in his lap and sighed as he focused. "We have court on the 18th of next month," he answered in a shrill, nervous tone. He ran a hand through his shaggy black hair and took a deep breath. Autumn raised an eyebrow. "And how does that make you feel?" Eugene shifted uncomfortably on the couch as he frowned. Over the many weeks, Eugene had opened up more and more to the therapist. But this has not eased his pain. In fact, it has made it more potent. In many ways, Eugene was opening himself up to a point that he would never be closed again. "I feel lost," Eugene began to say as he shook. Talking had not become any easier, but the will to do so had grown. "You feel lost?" Autumn noted as she wrote on her pad and then asked, "Can you explain that to me?" "Grace's mother was deathly sick on 2 separate occasions," Eugene began to explain, and he looked to the floor. "When you give everything to take care of someone through that, and then they turn around and mark you as evil, it breaks you. I don't even know where to begin looking for the pieces. That's why I'm lost." Autumn could feel the agony in each and every word as she listened, barely unable to keep her own composure. With Eugene in such a fragile place, she feared his malleability and what it could mean for everyone everywhere. It was imperative that she turned him around and set him on the path of the good man he desperately needed to be. Before she could ask anything more about the court case or his daughter, Eugene changed the subject. In a few moments, Autumn would wish he hadn't. "I had another dream the other night," he mentioned, and she tilted her head slightly. "It was awful," Eugene continued, his eyes widening as he thought of it. "I witnessed the human race invade and decimate another alternate Earth. The same Earth as before, with malevolent versions of us all, hungry for the multiverse's resources." Autumn was concerned as she knew who he was speaking of, without having to mention that they had discussed this Earth before. But their consistent attacks were beginning to concern her. She had recently died on 3 different worlds at their hands. "Tell me about it," she told him softly. "If you can." "The world was at war already," Eugene began as his voice trailed off into the story. "A fanatical dictator had taken office in the United States and began a purge against psychics of any kind. Even those who claimed to be psychics and mediums as a scam were ruthlessly rooted out. It wasn't long before the entire world joined the cause. Every nation on Earth was at civil war." Autumn's cheek muscle twitched as she listened to him explain the dream, as she knew all too well what Earth he was referencing. She did her best to remain composed and avoided eye contact with him for a moment as she wrote a personal note to herself on her pad. "Was there anything specific that you saw?" she asked him, and Eugene nodded. "Yes," he answered, and his expression focused. "There was a room full of psychics in New York City. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could feel another presence, something I hadn't felt before." Autumn frowned. "And what was that, Eugene?" Eugene looked into her eyes as he said, "It felt as if someone else foreign was there, like me, only physically. Another dreamer, seeing through their alternate." Autumn was beyond flabbergasted, as she nearly dropped her pen and had to hide her shaking hands. How could he have known about another dreamer while he was performing the same act himself? "The others knew this too, at least I think," Eugene kept going. "But something went wrong. A man from another world entered the room, and he committed suicide, bombing the entire floor of the building. I think he was from the murderously imperialistic Earth that I've seen before. He had the same exact tattoo on the back of his neck." Did everyone in the room die? Autumn asked, obviously aware that there were only 2 survivors, one of them being her. Eugene shrugged. I believe so, but that wasn't the end. They invaded the planet and murdered nearly all world leaders in the same fashion. They did this to weaken the Earth's defenses and to crush their alternates, just as they had many times before. They dragged the bodies from the psychics they had killed, Eugene continued, bowing his head for a moment as he tried to block out the horror as he retold it. They hung the lifeless bodies on display for everyone to see. There were millions of soldiers from the other Earth, systematically cutting down anyone in their way. Autumn was horrified and could no longer hide it, but Eugene wasn't even looking at her as he stared at his own shoes. However, Autumn had to know which bodies of her friends were dragged out. She just had to know. Did you recognize any of the bodies? She asked, trying her absolute best to retain the neutral tone she used for therapy. Just one, he murmured. Who? Autumn asked softly, petrified of who it could be. Eugene was quiet for a few moments as Autumn was nearly on the edge of her seat. But then the man looked back up, and he looked into her eyes. It was you, Eugene finally whispered, his expression torn in so many different ways. Autumn gulped as she and Eugene stared at one another for a few silent moments. Eugene was trembling as he tried to continue and then stopped, taking another deep breath. What happened next? Autumn asked, and although she didn't know the answer, she had to hear it. After she had died in the explosion, her view of that world was severed forever. They drained the planet of all resources, and once done, after no one would kneel, they nuked everything that was left. Eugene looked into her eyes with terror. Nobody survived. Why do I see these worlds die? Eugene croaked, and Autumn could feel the strain in his soul. The psychic therapist did her best to conceal her awe, hoping that her patient hadn't already taken notice. But he was too lost within himself to notice what other people were doing. And furthermore, he had no vested interest in them, much less the world around him. With each day that passes, Eugene was growing further from human connection. To him, this was nothing to be sad or happy for. It was simply his mode of existence now. He was going to walk alone as long as he could, or rather, as long as he had to. You've been through so much, Eugene, Autumn finally spoke, realizing that she needed to play the role she had taken. There's no telling what form trauma will take until it's done. Your mind is feeling the weight of your heart, and it's manifesting these nightmares as a result. 154 days, Eugene muttered, his eyes hollow. 22 weeks. That's how long it has been since I've even heard Grace's voice. Eugene began to openly sob, the first time he had actually done so in a session, in front of another human being. When the session finally came to an end, Eugene saw himself out, and when Autumn was certain that he had exited the building, she exhaled deeply. She began to sweat and had to grab a rag to dry her hands. As excited as she was to find Eugene, she was equally terrified of him, of what he could become. Once outside, Eugene produced a pack of full-flavored cigarettes and removed one. He lit up his smoke and immediately took a drag. He truly hated these things. The smell on one's clothes and their breath were enough, but he had seen many people he cared about have their lives taken early. Excuse me? A strong, male voice spoke in the darkness of the night as Eugene frowned, looking for whoever had spoken to him. There was a blond, muscular man standing nearby with a smile on his face. This smile unnerved Eugene, who could feel the cruel intent behind the man's eyes. The other man wore a simple green t-shirt and blue jeans, but there was nothing simple or casual about the way he stood before Eugene. "Do you have a smoke I could borrow?" the man asked, and Eugene shook his head. "Sorry, this is the last one." Eugene lied to him, slowly taking note that next time he finished a session, he should just go home first and smoke later. The other man shrugged. "Don't worry about it, friend. To be honest, I don't smoke the things. They're disgusting. I just wanted to relax the moment and have a pre-celebratory chat with you." Eugene began to awkwardly make his way towards his car, and to his dismay, the man followed him. Eugene reached for his keys in his front pocket and was ready to leave, when the man placed a hand on his shoulder. They looked at one another, and Eugene's new friend grinned. The man's expression stretched as his eyes darkened, and he said, "I've been searching the entire multiverse for you." Eugene's eyes widened as he listened, and realized that somehow, some way, this man knew of the dreams. Eugene reached for the handle on his driver door, and suddenly he was thrown against it. His face smacked the window, and he turned around only to be pinned against the car by his throat. "You'll stay where you are!" The man growled and narrowed his eyes before saying, "I am Evan, Herald of the Darkness, and I have finally found you." "Stop!" a powerful feminine voice shouted, and Evan turned his head to see Autumn standing about 10 feet behind him. There was a pistol in her hand, and the barrel was pointing directly at Eugene's attacker, who only shrugged. "Oh, Autumn," Evan purred as he looked her up and down. "It's good to see you again. The last time I saw you, you had a friend with you. I had a lot of fun with her." "Shut up!" Autumn growled and pointed the gun again, emphasizing the threat. "What was her name?" Evan asked, and then licked his lips. "Winter," Autumn answered, her face torn between rage and agony. "That's a beautiful name." Evan chuckled, and Autumn's eyes widened with blinding hatred. "Oh, please," Evan continued as he let go of Eugene and grinned. "You aren't going to shoot me. You don't have what it takes to kill a man." Autumn snorted and answered his challenge as she said, "Read my mind, asshole. You'll see for yourself if I have what it takes this time around." Evan stared at her for a moment before lunging forward, reaching for her skull. Autumn pulled the trigger and shot him in the kneecap, shattering it. Evan screamed and then cursed, falling to his one good knee. Before he could try and get back up, Eugene made his move, punching him square in the nose. Evan fell backwards and left the conscious world. "We have to go!" Autumn cried out and motioned for Eugene to get into his own car. Once inside, their adrenaline carried them down the road at blinding speeds. Once they began to process what had just happened, Eugene came to his senses. "We have to call the police," he mentioned, reaching for his phone. "No!" Autumn snapped, her eyes wide. The change in her behavior had Eugene unsettled, but he kept driving as he frowned. "Anywhere public isn't safe," Autumn continued. "My office and your home are now compromised. They'll look for us there first." Eugene raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "That can wait," the therapist answered him. "For now, there are people you must meet. They will keep us safe for the moment. At least, until we can figure out what to do next." Evan awoke an hour later, his face throbbing, but the agony of his ruined knee easily blocked it out. He rubbed the back of his head where it slammed after Eugene had struck him, when suddenly an aura had entered his mind. Master?" he murmured, his eyes wide with much more than alarm. There was a dead cold silence that lasted a moment before a dark, raspy voice spoke to Evan from the abyss. "Find them. A great evil murmured into his mind. Find the chosen, or I will devour your soul and find another. Yes, Evan said with a petrified nod. Yes, Master.